The 24th of May 1944. Near Cisterna di Littoria, Italy, Sergeant Sylvester Antolak was running across open ground with German machine gun fire cutting through the field ahead of him. There was no wall to hide behind, no trench close enough to reach, no thick forest to swallow him. The ground was flat, exposed, and unforgiving, the kind of ground where a man could feel every yard between himself and the enemy. Behind him, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, was being held down. The advance had slowed. Men who had been ordered forward were now pressed against the earth, pinned by fire from a German position that had turned the field into a killing zone. The machine gun did not need to stop an entire army. It only needed to stop this company. And for a few terrible minutes, it was doing exactly that. Antolak was out in front of his squad, moving toward the sound of the gun. Smoke drifted across the field. Dirt jumped around him where rounds struck the ground. Every step took him farther from cover and closer to the weapon that was holding his men in place. Then he was hit. For most men, that would have ended the charge. The body has its own commands. Get down, stay down, survive, let someone else move, wait for the fire to shift, wait for help, wait for anything other than standing up in the open while a German machine gun is still firing. But Antolak did not stay down. He rose. And he kept moving. The men behind him could see it. They could see one American sergeant, already wounded, forcing himself forward across ground that offered him almost nothing, no safe angle, no easy path, no promise that the next step would be there when his boot came down. The German gun was still ahead. The company was still pinned. The attack was still in danger of breaking apart before it could reach its objective. If Antolak stopped, the men behind him might remain trapped in place, unable to advance, unable to break the obstacle in front of them. If he kept going, he was moving directly into the fire that had already brought him down once. That was the choice. Stay on the ground and live a few moments longer. Or rise again and give the men behind him a reason to believe the field could still be crossed. He chose to rise. The second time he was hit, the logic of survival became even clearer. No one would have questioned him for staying down. No one would have called it cowardice. On that field near Cisterna, with machine gun fire sweeping the open ground, staying down was not weakness. It was instinct. But Antolak's story did not turn on instinct. It turned on duty. He continued forward, moving toward the German position that had stopped Company B. With each yard, the distance between him and the machine gun nest narrowed. With each yard, the men behind him saw something that was almost impossible to understand. A wounded soldier, still charging when every part of the battlefield told him to fall and remain still. This was not a charge from a painting. It was not clean. It was not glorious in the way people sometimes imagine battle from far away. It was smoke, noise, fear, exposed ground, and a man forcing himself toward the source of the fire because someone had to break the hold of that gun. The question is not simply how Sylvester Antolak kept moving after being hit. The real question is, what made him rise when staying down would have made perfect sense. To understand that, we have to go back only a short distance, not to his childhood, not to a broad history of the war, but to the Anzio breakout, and to the morning when Company B's advance began to meet the obstacle that would demand everything from one man. Only a short time before that charge, the fight near Cisterna had not yet narrowed to one man in an open field. It was part of the Anzio breakout, the Allied effort to break out from the beachhead in Italy and push inland after months of hard fighting. By the 24th of May 1944, American troops were no longer simply holding ground near the coast. They were trying to force their way through German defenses and open the road beyond Anzio. For Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, that meant advancing near Cisterna di Littoria. a place where the land itself offered little mercy. The ground did not look like a fortress. That was part of the danger. There were no towering walls, no dramatic cliffs, no single obvious barrier that told a man where death would come from. Instead, there were open stretches of Italian countryside, low cover, scattered concealment, and fields where a soldier could see too much distance between himself and the enemy. In that kind of terrain, a machine gun could become more than a weapon. It could become a gate. If it stayed in place, every man trying to cross that ground had to pass through its fire. If it was not silenced, the attack could slow, stall, and then collapse under pressure. The soldiers of Company B did not need a lecture on that fact. They could feel it every time the advance stopped, and every time a man looked forward and saw nothing solid enough to hide behind. Sergeant Sylvester Antolak was one of the men leading from the front. He was not a general directing arrows on a map. He was not a distant figure watching the battle through field glasses. He was a non-commissioned officer, close enough to the ground to see fear in men's faces, and close enough to the fire to understand what orders meant once the shooting began. That is the only biography needed here. Antolak was a U.S. Army sergeant in the 3rd Infantry Division, serving with Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment. Men like him carried the burden between command and survival. They had to keep a squad moving when the ground ahead looked impossible. They had to make decisions quickly, often without enough information, and often while the safest human instinct was to stop. He was not remembered because he came from a legend. He was remembered because, on one exposed piece of ground near Cisterna, he acted when the men around him needed someone to move first. As Company B pushed forward, the German defense began to show its shape. It was not one dramatic wall of resistance, but a series of deadly points that slowed the advance and forced the Americans down. Small groups of German soldiers could use the terrain, prepared positions, and automatic fire to hold up a larger force if they placed their weapons correctly. And one machine gun position was placed correctly. It covered the ground Company B needed to cross. The men could not simply walk around it, not under fire, not with the attack already in motion, not when hesitation could spread through a line faster than any spoken order. The longer that gun kept firing, the more it defined the battlefield. It told every American soldier where he could not go. It told Company B that the open ground ahead belonged to the enemy. That was the trap. The company had momentum, but momentum can die quickly when men are pinned to the earth. Every second under fire makes the next movement harder. Every failed attempt teaches the body to stay low. Every burst from the gun pushes the line closer to paralysis. Somewhere in that pressure, Antolak saw the problem clearly. The enemy position was not just firing at Company B. It was deciding whether Company B could advance at all. So the battle began to shrink. It was no longer about the whole Italian campaign. It was no longer about maps, beachheads, or distant objectives. It was about a stretch of exposed ground, a German machine gun, a company held in place, and a sergeant close enough to understand that waiting might cost more lives than moving. The men behind him needed the gun broken. The gun was still firing, and Antolak was about to step beyond the point where anyone could protect him. At first, the attack still had the shape of something that could be forced forward. Company B had a mission. The men knew the direction of advance. The enemy was in front of them, and the open ground near Cisterna had to be crossed. In battle, that kind of clarity can matter. A soldier may be afraid, but if he knows where to go, and if the men beside him are still moving, fear can be pushed down long enough for the line to keep advancing. But that clarity did not last. The German defense began to break the movement into pieces. A burst of fire would stop one group. Another burst would force men lower into the ground. A squad that had been moving together only moments before could suddenly become scattered across the field, each man looking for the smallest depression in the earth, the smallest fold in the terrain, anything that could stand between him and the gun. There was no dramatic cover waiting for them. The open ground did not give the Americans many choices. It exposed movement, it punished hesitation, and once the German machine gun found the field, every attempt to rise became a decision made under fire. Then the situation got worse. The machine gun position was not simply firing at random, it was controlling the space Company B needed. Every burst seemed to say the same thing: no farther. The men could hear it, feel it, and understand it without needing anyone to explain the tactical problem. The advance was being divided from its objective. The company was still there, the mission was still there, but between the two stood a German position that had turned distance into a weapon. 100 yards could feel like a mile if every step had to be taken under fire. A few seconds of movement could feel longer than minutes spent waiting, and waiting had its own danger. The longer the men stayed pinned, the harder it became to move again. Momentum was fading. A unit under machine gun fire can lose more than ground. It can lose the belief that the next order is possible. The body begins to accept the earth as the only safe place left. The mind begins to calculate survival in inches instead of yards. Antolak saw that danger. He was close enough to the men to know what the gun was doing to them. It was not only threatening their lives, it was freezing the attack in place. If no one moved, the machine gun would keep its authority over the field. If the position was not broken, Company B would remain trapped below it. There was one more problem. The machine gun nest could not be wished away from a distance. Someone had to get close enough to silence it, or close enough to make the men behind him believe that it could be reached. That meant crossing the very ground the weapon was built to command. It meant moving where no man had a good reason to stand. Antolak moved ahead. Not as a speech, not as a gesture made from safety. He moved with the directness of a sergeant who understood that the battle had narrowed to a single obstruction. He went out in front of his squad, drawing closer to the German position, while the men behind him remained pinned by the fire. The field opened around him. Every yard separated him more sharply from the protection of numbers. Behind him were the men of Company B. Ahead of him was the gun. Around him was the exposed Italian ground, smoke drifting low, the air broken by fire, the battlefield reduced to a terrible simplicity. The enemy could see him. That was the point and the danger. By moving forward, Antolak gave the German gunners a target. He also gave his own men something else, a visible sign that the line had not stopped completely. In moments like that, one man's movement can matter more than an order shouted from behind. It can tell pinned soldiers that the impossible ground is still being contested. Then he was hit. The charge should have ended there. No one behind him needed to be told what had happened. They could see the movement break. They could see the sergeant go down or falter under the force of the fire. On that field, there would have been a brutal kind of understanding in the minds of the men watching. That was what happened when someone tried to cross. That was why no one wanted to rise. But then Antolak rose again. The men behind him were no longer watching only an attack. They were watching a decision being made in the open, under fire, by a man who had already paid for the first attempt. He did not have the protection of surprise anymore. He did not have the comfort of distance. He had a wounded body, an enemy gun still firing, and a stretch of open ground still ahead. He kept moving. The charge became harder to understand and harder to ignore. Every step was now a contradiction of the instinct that tells a man to stay down. Every yard carried him closer to the enemy position, and every yard made the men behind him see that the machine gun, terrifying as it was, had not stopped him yet. And then he was hit again. This time, the choice became even more severe. The ground itself seemed to argue against him. The fire ahead argued against him. Pain, shock, and survival all argued against him. Even duty could have ended there, and no honest man could have judged him. But Antolak continued forward. By then, the battle had narrowed completely. Not to the whole Anzio breakout, not to the full advance near Cisterna, not even to Company B as a line on a map. It had narrowed to one wounded sergeant, one German machine gun position, and the open ground between them. The men behind him were still pinned. The gun was still ahead, and Antolak was still moving toward it. By then, every man behind him understood what he was trying to do. The German machine gun position had become the lock on the field, and Company B could not pass until that lock was broken. The men could not advance by courage alone. They needed the gun silenced. They needed the enemy position disrupted. They needed someone to close the distance that none of them could cross safely. Antolak had already been hit. He had already gone down. He had already been given the reason most men would have accepted as final. But he kept going. The ground ahead of him was flat and exposed. That was what made the moment so severe. There was no dramatic cover to reach, no stone wall waiting just a few steps away, no friendly vehicle rolling up to shield him. He was a single American sergeant moving across open Italian ground, while German fire cut through the space in front of him. Behind him, Company B watched from the earth. Some men could see him clearly. Others may have caught only pieces of the movement through smoke, dust, and the confusion of battle, but they understood the shape of what was happening. One man was advancing where the company had been stopped. One man was drawing the fire that had pinned them down. One man was proving, yard by yard, that the field had not yet been surrendered to the machine gun. Then the fire found him again. A second wound should have ended it. In that instant, survival had the strongest argument on the battlefield. Stay down. Do not rise. Let the earth cover you. Let the noise pass over you. Let the men behind you find another way, or wait for another order, or bring up another weapon. No one would have blamed him. But Antolak rose again. That was the moment the men behind him would carry in their minds. Not simply that he charged, but that he rose after the charge should have been over. He had crossed from bravery into something harder to explain. He was no longer acting as if he believed he could come through untouched. That possibility had already been taken from him. He was acting because the men behind him still needed the gun broken. He moved forward again. Every step brought him closer to the German position. Every step made him more exposed. The enemy gunners could see the threat now, and they could understand it. If this wounded sergeant reached them, the position that had controlled the field might be lost. If he failed, Company B might remain pinned in place. The battlefield had become brutally simple. One gun, one open field, one man refusing to stop. The men behind him were not watching a legend. They were watching a soldier in real time, under fire, forcing his body toward a position that had already struck him down more than once. There was no clean heroism in it. There was no distance from the danger. There was only the pressure of the moment, the smoke drifting across the ground, the sound of automatic fire, and the sight of Antolak closing the gap. Then he was hit again. This time, the question became almost unbearable. How does a man keep charging after that? The answer was not that he felt no fear. Men who had seen battle knew better than that. The answer was not that the field had become safe. It had not. The answer was not that the danger had passed. The danger was directly ahead of him, still firing, still holding Company B down. The answer was that Antolak had placed the men behind him above the instinct to save himself. He kept moving toward the machine gun nest. The German position, which had seemed so powerful from a distance, was now being threatened by one wounded soldier who would not accept the authority of its fire. The closer he came, the more the balance of the moment changed. Machine guns are built to dominate distance. They are terrifying when they can hold men away. But if a determined attacker closes that distance, the weapon's advantage begins to narrow. Antolak pressed forward until the obstacle that had stopped Company B was no longer distant and unreachable. He reached the enemy position. In the chaos of those final yards, the German gun that had controlled the field was broken as an obstacle. The men of Company B, who had been pinned and forced low, now had the opening they had needed. The fire that had locked them down no longer held the same power. The impossible ground ahead of them had been crossed by one man first. That mattered. In combat, a single action can change more than a tactical position. It can change what men believe they are able to do. A moment earlier, the field had looked uncrossable. The German gun had seemed to own the space. The safest thing had been to stay down and wait. But Antolak's charge changed the meaning of the ground in front of them. He had shown them that the line could still move. And when the men behind him saw that, they moved. The attack did not become easy. Nothing about that field became safe. But the machine gun position that had stopped Company B had been broken long enough for the company to continue forward. The men behind Antolak now had the chance his charge had bought for them. He had not saved himself. He had cleared the way. And the cost of that choice would become the reason his name was carried beyond the field near Cisterna. The opening Antolak bought did not erase the danger from the field. The fight near Cisterna was still violent, uncertain, and costly. Company B still had to move through ground that had already proven how exposed it was. German resistance had not disappeared simply because one position had been broken, but something important had changed. The machine gun nest that had held the company down was no longer controlling the advance in the same way. For the men behind Antolak, that mattered immediately. They had been pinned to the earth, forced to measure survival by inches, with the enemy position deciding what ground could and could not be crossed. His charge gave them the chance to move again. It disrupted the obstacle in front of them, helped eliminate the position that had blocked the company, and turned a stalled attack back into an advance. That was the direct result, but the deeper result was harder to measure. The men of Company B had seen a sergeant go forward when every visible fact on the battlefield argued against it. They had seen him hit, rise, and continue toward the weapon that was holding them down. They had seen a man cross the ground first, not because it was safe, not because survival was likely, but because the company needed someone to break the hold of that gun. Combat often turns on weapons, numbers, terrain, and orders. But sometimes, in a narrow and terrible moment, it turns on whether one person moves when everyone else has been forced to stop. Sylvester Antolak did not survive that action near Cisterna di Littoria. He gave his life during the Anzio Breakout on the 24th of May, 1944, while serving as a sergeant in Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. His actions helped clear the way for his company to continue forward, and, for that courage, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. That medal is the official record. But the official record is not the whole meaning of what happened. A citation can state what a man did. It can describe the charge, the wounds, the enemy position, and the result. It can preserve the facts for the nation. But it cannot fully capture what it meant for the men behind him to watch someone rise after he had every reason to stay down. That is why this story still matters. Not because war should be made glorious. It should not. The field near Cisterna was not glorious. It was smoke, fear, exposed ground, and men trying to live through a few more minutes. What deserves to be remembered is not the violence itself, but the burden one soldier accepted inside it. Antolak's charge was not simply an act of attack. It was an act of sacrifice. He moved forward so others could move. He accepted the most dangerous ground so the men behind him would not remain trapped by it. He turned one impossible stretch of open field into a path his company could follow. And in that moment, he changed what the men behind him believed was possible. Near Cisterna di Littoria, one soldier kept charging after he was hit, and because he did, the men behind him found the strength to rise.